The English Revolution. Part 1. Levellers. The Reformation, with its attendant social, religious and political changes, was the first occasion on which political, religious and social matters became a topic of widespread popular concern. The new technology of printing, the internet of its age I suppose you could call it, made the production and dissemination of pamphlets and controversial literature possible, and the importance of the changes that were taking place or were contemplated provided the energy necessary for authorship. Up to this time, religious and political controversy was, for the most part, an academic matter, written in Latin, the universal medium of scholarly written communication, and thus confined to a tiny section of the population. From now on, anyone who could read had access to copious amounts of material in his native language. Vast as was the literature relating to the religious changes that swept over Europe in the 16th century, it paled into insignificance when compared to the massive output of popular writings relating to the religious and political issues that gripped the English mind in the 17th century. An incomplete listing of pamphlets produced in the 20 years between 1640 and 1660 runs to almost 20,000 titles. This pamphlet debate, writes George Sabine, was the first great experiment in popular political education, using the printing press as the organ of government by discussion. David Wootton writes, "The Civil War, however, saw the appearance of a quite new type of political theorising. With the breakdown of central authority, men such as Lilburne, Walwyn and Winstanley, none of whom had much formal education, sought to address a new political audience of craftsmen, apprentices and common soldiers. Writing at speed, often when in prison, and printing on hastily organised clandestine presses, the pamphlets and broadsheets they produced were crudely printed and coarsely illustrated. There is, however, no European parallel to the Putney debates, no French Lilburne or Spanish Walwyn, and the English Civil War can properly be described as having called forth a revolution in political thought." The central bones of contention were religious and political. From the religious perspective, the question was the Church in England going to become a modified version of Catholicism, complete with bishops, or was it going to become an English type of Presbyterian Calvinism? What was to be done with those people who wanted neither an Episcopal nor a Presbyterian church? From the political perspective, the question was who would eventually triumph in the struggle between the increasingly absolutist Stuart monarchy under the second Stuart king, Charles I, and an increasingly assertive Parliament. The two perspectives were not hermetically sealed, and the interaction of religious and political factors created an explosive situation that eventually resulted in open war. In the late 1640s, a semi-organised group emerged which was known pejoratively as the Levellers because of its presumed intent to flatten all social and religious hierarchies. John Lilburne, William Walwyn and Richard Overton were the most prominent members of this group, all disclaimed, with varying degrees of ingenuousness, any levelling intent. The Levellers gave voice to the political and religious concerns of those on the fringes of the newly emerging middle class. More radical, but even less organised than the Levellers, and thus more ephemeral, were those called the Diggers, sometimes called true Levellers, whose controversial literature appears in the main to have been the production of just one man, Gerard Winstanley. If the Levellers were lower middle class men with at least some stake in the community, the Diggers were those with little or no property at all, and who thus tended to be socially and economically marginalised. Sabine writes, "As the Levellers were an early instance of radical middle-class democracy with political aims, the Diggers are more easily classified as the beginning of utopian communism." The active involvement of Levellers and Diggers in real-life politics was brief and, in the event, ineffectual. However, their importance is not so much in their practical achievements, or rather lack of practical achievements, but in the ideas which they were among the first to articulate and which they bequeathed to later generations. In 1647, after the struggle between Parliament and King had resulted in victory for the parliamentary forces, Parliament, fearful of the army it had itself created, ordered its disbandment. The soldiers who had not been paid and who were not satisfied that the changes they had fought for would be implemented revolted, and Parliament capitulated. An army council representing both officers and rank and file was set up. In October and November of 1647, in an extraordinary and unprecedented turn of events, the Army Council met to discuss proposals contained in a Leveller document entitled The Agreement of the People. The lower ranks and some few officers called, among other things, for the franchise to be widely extended, for equality before the law, and for the elimination of religious coercion. Most of the higher officers, including Oliver Cromwell and his son-in-law Henry Ireton, were unwilling to adopt what they saw as sweeping changes to the English constitution, not least because of its effect on the rights of property holders. 1647 was the high water mark of Leveller influence. Later that year, the escape of the king from his army guards and the resumption of hostilities forced the army to reunite around their leaders, and the Leveller influence was somewhat dissipated in the exigencies of meeting the renewed royalist challenge. Despite this disruption, in the latter part of 1648, the army, having purged Parliament and seized political power, negotiated a modified form of the Agreement of the People with the Levellers. Despite the name given to them by their political opponents, the Levellers did not in fact propose the sweeping away of all differences of rank and title, nor did they propose the abolition or redistribution of property. One can find constant denials in their literature to this effect, and there can be no doubt that these denials were, to varying degrees, sincere. We find them professing that we never had it in our thoughts to level men's estates, it being the utmost of our aim that the Commonwealth be reduced to such a pass that every man may, with as much security as may be, enjoy his propriety. Some of the Levellers, Lilburne for example, may have been more in earnest with this protestation than others, such as Walwyn. John Gurney believes that we are entitled to some scepticism on this matter, as were many of the Levellers' contemporaries. The Levellers' views on private property, he writes, were never wholly consistent. Lilburne was probably the most outspoken in his opposition to the conceit of levelling propriety and magistracy. Overton acknowledged the advantages of opening up impropriated common land and turning it over to the poor, a move that would have infringed the property rights of landowners, while Walwyn never convincingly repudiated the accusation that he had, in theory at least, some sympathy for the idea of community of property. The truth is more likely to be that the views of many of the radicals, levellers and diggers alike, had been rapidly acquired and, being neither fully assimilated nor articulated, were capable of development in the light of circumstances. Henry Brailsford, for example, remarks of the digger Gerard Winstanley that his thought was in flux and underwent a rapid development. His voluminous writing was all done, much of it rapidly, in 4 years. He had little sense for form or order in his compositions, and often seemed to be thinking aloud. Whatever differences they may have had on other issues, the Levellers one and all objected to legally created and legally maintained monopolies. The effective monopoly of political power by the nobility and gentry, the economic monopolies enjoyed by the merchants, and the professional monopolies enjoyed by the lawyers. Sabine notes, the Levellers appear to have grasped with remarkable clearness the point of view of radical democratic liberalism, individualist rather than socialist in its philosophy, and political rather than economic in its aims. The equality they sought, or the equality they said they sought, was not any radical egalitarianism implying wholesale redistribution of property, but an equality of all men before the law and in political representation. In the course of the Putney debates, Henry Ireton was sceptical of the purported limited nature of the Leveller claims, and urged against them that those claims, taken to their logical conclusion, did in fact undermine the existing and possibly all property regimes. On what basis did the Levellers make their claims? Well, as one might expect, there are appeals to scripture in their writings, but equally appeals to what is reasonable and natural. Reason and to nature showing forth self-evidently the basic rights of all men simply as men. For the Leveller writers, reason and revelation coincide, man's rationality being a creaturely reflection of the divine mind. Consider the following passage from John Milburn, which I quote in full, as the shortest complete passage of its kind, and which stands and finishes as a scriptural reflection, but which moves seamlessly from scriptural quotation to rational considerations and back again, and from the use of scriptural epithets such as wicked, devilish, and sinful, to the use of rational epithets such as unnatural and unjust. He writes, God, the absolute sovereign Lord and King of all things in heaven and earth, the original fountain and cause of all causes, who is circumscribed, governed, and limited by no rules, but doth all things merely and only by his sovereign will and unlimited good pleasure, who made the world and all things therein for his own glory, and who by his own will and pleasure gave him, his mere creature, the sovereignty under himself over all the rest of his creatures, and endued him with a rational soul or understanding, and thereby created him after his own image. The first of which was Adam, a male or man, made out of the dust or clay, out of whose side was taken a rib, which, by the sovereign and absolute mighty creating power of God, was made a female or woman called Eve, which two are the earthly original fountain as begetters and bringers forth of all and every particular and individual man and woman that ever breathed in the world since, who are and were by nature all equal, alike in power, dignity, authority, and majesty, none of them having, by nature, any authority, dominion, or magisterial power, one over or above another. Neither have they, nor can they, exercise any but merely by institution or donation, that is to say, by mutual agreement or consent, given, derived, or assumed by mutual consent and agreement, for the good benefit and comfort each of other, and not for the mischief, hurt, or damage of any, it being unnatural, irrational, sinful, wicked, and unjust for any man or men whatsoever to part with so much of their power as shall enable any of their parliament men, commissioners, trustees, deputies, viceroys, ministers, officers, or servants to destroy and undo them therewith. And unnatural, irrational, sinful, wicked, unjust, devilish, and tyrannical it is for any man whatsoever, spiritual or temporal, clergyman or layman, to appropriate and assume unto himself a power, authority, and jurisdiction to rule, govern, or reign over any sort of men in the world without their free consent. And whosoever doth it, whether clergyman or any other whatsoever, do thereby as much as in them lies endeavour to appropriate and assume unto themselves the office and sovereignty of God, who alone doth and is to rule by his will and pleasure, and to be like their Creator, which was the sin of the devils, who, not being content with their first station, but would be like God, for which sin they were thrown down into hell, reserved in everlasting chains, under darkness, unto the judgment of the great day. And Adam's sin it was which brought the curse upon him and all his posterity, that he was not content with the station and condition that God created him in, but did aspire unto a better and more excellent, namely, to be like his Creator, which proved his ruin. Yea, and indeed had been the everlasting ruin and destruction of him and all his, had not God been the more merciful unto him in the promised Messiah. The religious argument is this: God, by virtue of his creation of us, is our only natural sovereign. Anyone attempting to exercise dominion over another without his consent is usurping God's position. The rationalist argument in this passage comes to this: all men are equal by nature. Therefore, no one can rightfully exercise authority over another except by the consent of that other. The word nature or variance thereof occurs 4 times in this passage, with 2 occurrences of unjust and 1 each of agreement, consent, equal, and rational. The Levellers' justification for their demands appears to veer somewhat erratically between an appeal to traditional or customary liberties on the one hand, and a much more radical conception of natural rights apart from any customary or traditional instantiation on the other. In the Putney debates, Ayrton's response to the Leveller demands is to ask them repeatedly which of these 2 is the source of their proposals. Sabine remarks, "The distinction between customary and natural right was a bone of contention between Ayrton and the representatives of the regiments. Let's look at some examples of the Leveller literature to see for ourselves just what they proposed. In a remonstrance written by Overton in 1646 with the help of Walwyn, we have an impassioned calling to account of the House of Commons. "What have you done?" the authors ask. "We elected you to set us free, to deliver us from all kinds of bondage, and to preserve the Commonwealth in peace and happiness. Remember," they say, "we are your principals and you are agents. For if you or any other shall assume or exercise any power that is not derived from our trust and choice thereunto, that power is no less than usurpation and an oppression from which we expect to be freed." They go on to say, "That trust which we have given to you, we can revoke if we so choose." If a king is to be a lawful magistrate, then he must demonstrate the lawfulness of his authority, which must be from the voluntary trust of the people. And then the case is the same with them as between the people and you. They, as you, being possessed of no more power than what is in the people, justly to entrust. Since the time of the Norman invasion, this country has been held in bondage by the policies and force of the officers of trust in the Commonwealth, amongst whom we always esteemed kings the chiefest. We trusted you to deliver us from his oppression. What, asked Overton impatiently, is all this nonsense you parliamentarians are telling us about needing the consent of the lords and king to make laws? Ye only are chosen by us the people, and therefore in you only is the power of binding the whole nation by making, altering or abolishing of laws. As things stand, the laws of the nation are unworthy of a free people. Magna Carta is but a beggarly thing containing many marks of intolerable bondage, and the laws that have been made since by parliaments have, in very many particulars, made our government much more oppressive and intolerable. Imprisonment for debt is deplorable, as is the practice of the new model army of impressment into military service. In words which, suitably updated, could have been written in the turbulent 1960s, Overton writes, "We entreat you to consider what difference there is between binding a man to an oar as a galley slave in Turkey or Argier, and pressing of men to serve in your war. To surprise a man on the sudden, force him from his calling, where he lived comfortably from a good trade, from his dear parents, wife or children, against inclination and disposition, to fight for a cause he understands not, and in company of such as he has no comfort to be withal, for pay that will scarce give him sustenance, and if he live, to return to a lost trade, or beggary, or not much better. If any tyranny or cruelty exceed this, it must be worse than that of a Turkish galley slave." Another Leveller tract, Walwyn's Toleration Justified and Persecution Condemned, contains a plea for religious tolerance, which, in the context of the period, is little short of astonishing. The tract is, in essence, a complaint that the Presbyterians, now that they are in the ascendant, are behaving every bit as intolerantly as the Episcopal leaders of the Church did when they were in the ascendant. Walwyn argues that every man ought to be free in the worship and service of God, compulsion being the way to increase not the number of converts, but of hypocrites. Against the argument put forward by the Presbyterian Synod that such toleration as is desired by the Independents is nowhere else to be found, Walwyn's response is that the practice of states is to be judged by God's law and the rule of reason, not the other way round. In passages that anticipate the later writing of John Stuart Mill by 200 years, Walwyn argues that it cannot be just to set bounds or limitations to toleration any further than the safety of the people requires. The more horrid and blasphemous the opinion is, the easier suppressed by reason and argument. The likeliest way to find out the truth will be by giving liberty to every man to speak his mind and produce his reasons and argument, and not by hearing one sect only. However, the most remarkable piece of Leveller writing of all has to be Overton's Arrow Against All Tyrants. The majority of Leveller documents concern themselves with asserting the fundamental equality of all men and arguing for universal suffrage, equality before the law, limited terms for members of Parliament, and so on. Overton's Arrow Against All Tyrants is very different. It has without doubt the most philosophically interesting opening section of any of the many pieces of Leveller literature. The force of the arguments and assertions here depend in large part on a certain conception of nature. In the first two paragraphs alone, the word nature, or one of its derivatives, is used 14 times. God, of course, enters into Overton's account, but only indirectly as the author and guarantor of man's nature. Well, you might think, we have had natural law theories aplenty already. What's so unusual about Overton's? The answer lies in Overton's linkage of nature with property, in particular with the notion of a property in oneself, a notion that achieves prominence in Locke's second treatise on government some 43 years later, and which many believe to have originated with him. To every individual in nature, writes Overton, is given an individual property by nature not to be invaded or usurped by any. For every one as he is himself, so he has a self-propriety, else could he not be himself. And of this no second may presume to deprive any of without manifest violation and affront to the very principles of nature, and of the rules of equity and justice between man and man. Mine and thine cannot be except this be. What Overton is saying comes to something like this. Simply by being, every man has a property in himself. If he had not, he could not be himself. The principles of nature and equity and justice prohibit interference with this self-ownership by any third party. This property in oneself is at the root of all further distinctions between what belongs to you and what belongs to another. By nature, all men have this property in themselves, so that all are alike equal and all alike are free. This is self-evident. Overton writes, "For by natural birth, all men are equally and alike born to like propriety, liberty, and freedom. And as we are delivered of God by the hand of nature into this world, every one with a natural innate freedom and propriety, as it were writ in the table of every man's heart, never to be obliterated, even so are we to live, every one equally and alike to enjoy his birthright and privilege, even all whereof God by nature has made him free." All our human powers have their origin in our self-property, and our actions cannot contradict our enjoyment of our liberty. No man can give to another more than he himself has, and no man, Overton thinks, naturally would be befooled of his liberty by his neighbour's craft or enslaved by his neighbour's might. In respect of himself, each man is his own lord and master, and any rights that another may come to have over him can come only from that man's consent. Every man by nature, writes Overton, being a king, priest and prophet in his own natural circuit and compass, whereof no second may partake but by deputation, commission, and free consent from him whose natural right and freedom it is. The political implication of all this is as follows. Our rulers, leaders, governors have rightful powers over us only to the extent that we have given it to them. Such powers they have only for the purposes of our benefit, acting as our agents, commissioners and lawful deputies, while we remain principals, and they have it only so long as they act for our benefit. Just as no man willingly injures himself, so no man can willingly communicate a rightful power to another to injure him. Sabine comments, "The interesting and distinctive feature of the Leveller philosophy is the new form which it gave to the ancient conceptions of natural right and consent. They interpreted the law of nature as endowing human individuals with innate and inalienable rights, which legal and political institutions exist only to protect, and they construed consent as an individual act which every man is entitled to perform for himself." Overton reminds parliamentarians, the Presbyterian leadership, and the army that the arguments they offered in support of their resistance to Charles can be offered, if need be, against themselves. They rejected the tyranny, oppression, and cruelty of Charles as detrimental to the safety and good of the people. So too, their rule can similarly be rejected if it replicates the defects of royal rule. For, comments Overton, tyranny, oppression, and cruelty whatsoever and in whomsoever is itself unnatural, illegal, yea, absolutely anti-magisterial. For it is even destructive to all human civil society and therefore resistible. With the king in custody, the Civil War victors were faced with a now what situation. Multilateral discussions took place between Charles and Parliament and the army and the City of London. Within the victorious army, there were very distinct and opposed points of view as to what should be done next. In 1647, the General Council of the Army met to discuss proposals put to them by the largely Leveller element in the army, which effectively amounted to the following. Members of Parliament should be allocated in a manner proportionate to population. Parliament should sit for a limited 2-year term, and no longer. Matters of religion and public worship do not come within the remit of Parliament, and so cannot constitute the substance of any coercive law. Impressment to the army is contrary to freedom and cannot be allowed. Laws are to be made for the good of all and must be applicable to all. In the light of our subsequent political experience in the last 4 centuries, these proposals don't seem widely unreasonable, but in the context of the day, they occasion much heart-searching. The senior army commanders, Ireton and Cromwell included, were essentially conservative and inclined to make as few changes as were absolutely necessary to resolve their immediate problems. The representatives of the regiments were in favour of more sweeping changes. Both sides in the debate saw Parliament as being representative of the people. But while the senior army commanders held to the traditional view that such representation was of estates or of corporations or of property holders, or, as Ireton put it, those with an interest or share in the disposing or determining of the affairs of the kingdom, the Leveller interests portray the relationship or representation as subsisting between Parliament and the individual person. George Sabine notes that these two features of their political philosophy, the delegated power of Parliament and the right of every man to consent to law through his representatives, were the grounds upon which they urged the main parts of their radical programme. Putting it at its simplest, the key issue on representation comes to this. The Levellers argue that all men were subject to law and so should be in a position to determine who their lawmakers were. This position was movingly expressed by Thomas Rainborough in a passage that has become justly famous. He wrote, "I think that the poorest he that is in England has a life to live as the greatest he. And therefore, truly, sir, I think it's clear that every man that is to live under a government ought first by his own consent to put himself under that government. And I do think that the poorest man in England is not at all bound in a strict sense to that government that he has not had a choice to put himself under. And I am confident that when I have heard the reasons against it, something will be said to answer these reasons, inasmuch that I should doubt whether he was an Englishman or not that should doubt of these things." The opposing position was articulated clearly by Henry Ireton. He was willing to concede that all those born in England should be protected from ejection from the kingdom, should have air and place and ground and the freedom of the highways and other things to live among us. But since Parliament disposes of funds raised by taxes from those with a permanent interest in the kingdom, that is to say, of men holding a certain minimum of property, only such as are affected by such taxation should be in a position to determine the lawmakers. No representation without taxation. Against the Leveller position, Ireton argued forcefully that their demands on representation, if put into effect, could very well result in a situation where no property would be secure, since those who would not bear the burden of taxation would be able to lay that burden on others. If all men have a right to voice in elections simply by nature, then, by that same right of nature, by which you can say a man has an equal right with another to the choosing of him that shall govern him, by the same right of nature he has the same right in any goods he sees, meat, drink, clothes, to take and use them for his sustenance. He has a freedom to the land, the ground, to exercise it, till it. He has the freedom to anything that anyone does account himself to have any property in. One is reminded of Bastiat's aphorism, "Government is that great fiction through which everybody endeavours to live at the expense of everybody else." Anyone who lives in a modern democracy cannot but be aware that one part of the population pays for what another part of the population consumes, and that he who robs Peter to pay Paul may always count on Paul's enthusiastic support. Neither side of this debate is widely unreasonable. On the one hand, the leveller position is that those who are permanently be affected by law should have a say in choosing their lawmakers. On the other hand, Ayrton's position is that those who pay the bills should have the final say over what bills are to be paid. What seems to have occurred to neither party was that the problem lies somewhat deeper than either supposes, and that the whole notion of representation is suspect. If Parliament were to have the power to make laws binding on the whole Commonwealth, but not to exact taxes or otherwise affect the disposition of property, then the basis of Ayrton's objections to universal suffrage would disappear. On the other hand, if Parliament had no power of lawmaking at all, then the leveller objection to property holder only suffrage would disappear. The levellers were suspicious that the outcome of the revolution would be that the very same powers exercised heretofore by the king would from now on be exercised by Parliament. As it turns out, in the long run their suspicion was justified, with this salient difference, that while the king exercised the executive functions of state, Parliament could, with some degree of success, oppose his tax measures. But when the executive functions came to be exercised by a subcommittee of Parliament itself, and that after all is what the Cabinet is, the possibility of Parliament's opposing the will of the executive disappeared like mist on the summer's morning. If that were to happen, as it did, all that the revolution would have effected would have been a change of master, and, as Lysander Spooner remarked, a man is none the less a slave because he is allowed to choose a new master once in a term of years. What the Levellers' agreement was groping towards was the idea of a set of constitutional provisions limiting the power of any legislature or any executive, something like the 1653 Instrument of Government or the Bill of Rights of 1689, if somewhat more radical. A 1649 pamphlet, An Agreement of the Free People of England, proposes a more extensive list of proposals. Of particular interest is the listing of what Parliament can and cannot do. What it can do is to preserve peace, international commerce, give effect to the safeguards of life, limb and property requested by Parliament of the King in the 1628 Petition of Right, raise money, provided the burdens would fall equally upon all, and to do whatever is conducive to these ends or the enlargement of freedom, redress of grievances and economic prosperity. Among the things that Parliament cannot do is to constrain men in matters of conscience regarding religion, impress men into the army or navy, extend special legal privileges to some and not others, give judgment except under law, require self-incrimination in criminal cases, restrain free trade either directly or by means of excises or customs, permit people to avoid paying their debts or imprison people for debt, continue or extend capital punishment to crimes not destructive of society, impose tithes, and appoint clergy. By 1649, however, the Levellers' moment had come and gone. The army had seized control of the government, various mutinies had been repressed, political dissension stifled, and the indecision stemming from the vacillation concerning the fate of the monarchy had been drastically resolved by the execution of the king.